Welcome everyone to the Floodplain Risk Management Committee meeting held today on the 26th of September 2023. I declare the meeting open at 6:35 p.m. I would like to acknowledge the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of all lands, waters and sky in the Georges River area. Notice of live streaming of committee meeting. Staff and public are reminded that this meeting is being recorded for minute-taking purposes and is also being webcast live on Council's website. This recording will be made available on Council's website. Code of meeting practice. The order of business is as shown in the agenda, which has been made available. Staff and public are reminded that this meeting is open. Doors to the meeting are left open unless the meeting moves into a closed confidential session, according to the Section 15 of the Code of Meeting Practice. Council's Code of Meeting Practice prohibits the electronic recording of meetings without the express permission of Council. Mobile phones must be turned to silent during the meeting. I'm now going on to apologies. Are there any apologies for this meeting? No? Okay, moving on. Do we have any disclosures of interest that we have to, does anyone have to declare? No? I'll move on to the next item. Public participation. There is public participation on this meeting. There is one speaker registered for tonight's meeting. I would like to remind the speaker that speakers have a 3-minute limit. The first sound you hear indicates that you have 1 minute remaining. At the second sound, please conclude your comments. Teresa?
Good evening. I have 3 concerns as we start the meeting this evening. The first one is that the minutes that are being presented to us today from the last meeting in February are not an accurate and true record of that meeting. There were so many take matters on notice that are not included in the minutes, and I don't know if that information has been provided. It was a question that came from the committee as we gathered here that had relevance to the matter, being the floodplain risk management. So why aren't those questions on notice included in the minutes? Why can they be left aside and we have no idea if they have been actually dealt with? So my first concern is that the minutes are not an accurate one. Second is that the questions with notice haven't been included as best as I can see. The third matter that does bother me also is that Cogra Bay and Blakehurst wards have not been included in the floodplain risk assessment. This whole study and plan started well before amalgamation, and both former Cogra, were involved in doing their own assessment of water, stormwater, Cogra Bay, siltation. There was a lot that was being done by former Cogra Council. Right now, Cogra Bay and Blakehurst don't exist. We've just ignored them, and yet that group of ratepayers are very relevant to this discussion. I am assured, but I have no evidence, that there has been money granted for such a study, but yet we have not had the ward councillors nor the council putting forward and saying we need to do something about that. That makes the 3 minutes. That was a warning, was it?
Yeah, 1 minute left.
Very nice, thank you. Well, I'll leave it alone that I do not agree with the minutes that are being presented tonight.
Thank you, Teresa. I now call a motion to adopt the minutes of the previous meeting. Now it's just an acknowledgement. We don't need to do a vote. Just need a mover and seconder.
Yeah, I'll move that.
Do I have a seconder? You can do it.
I'll second it.
Who was it? All right, Tom. All right, I acknowledge the minutes have been approved. We now go on to the next agenda item, which will be presented by Erin Askew. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. Okay, so I've just got a presentation up on the screen. So today we're here to talk about the finalisation of the overland flow floodplain risk management study and plan for the Hurstville, Mortdale and Peakhurst wards. I'll quickly do an overview of the study area, a background to the floodplain risk management process under which this study has been undertaken, the project goals which guided the project and its outcomes, the flooding hotspots that were identified, the recommendations that were made, the outcomes of the public exhibition period, and where to from here. So the study area, as I said, is the Hurstville, Peakhurst and Mortdale wards. This represented the former Hurstville local government area and is a follow-on from a flood study that was done in that area earlier on, I believe it was 2016. So the typical flood behaviour within this catchment is what we call overland flow. The point that I'll make here is that it doesn't include the rivers and creeks. It's about the rainfall that runs off the catchment towards those systems. And runoff is generally not confined to the pit and pipe system. We're talking about events that are larger than those and exceed those systems. It's typically quite shallow in nature, while we do have some areas that are deeper, it's generally shallow. And there's typically not a great difference in the depth between different size events. It generally does not cause above floor inundation, and it often occurs quickly but disappears just as fast. Some of the challenges when we're looking at overland flow are the community's understanding of what we're talking about with overland flow. So flood means different things to different people. Within urbanised communities, there's often a very low tolerance for water not fitting within the pipe systems. But stormwater systems are typically designed to carry quite small flood events, so generally around a 5-year, where we're looking at sort of the 1% and 100-year event in these types of studies. Rainfall can sometimes pond due to poor design or grading issues at locations, and these would more typically be called a stormwater or local drainage issue, not really an overland flow issue. So overland flow is essentially the locations that there used to be a depression or there used to be a minor creek line, and that's where the water flows now. The reason that I wanted to talk about this here today, because at the start of the study, the council staff provided us a number of complaints that had been received from the community of flooding issues, but generally most of these actually fall into that local drainage basket. So there is a recommendation within the report to address those, but I just wanted to talk about it here. So, you know, a way that we can differentiate between what's a stormwater issue and what's an overland flow issue. So things like, does it happen every time it rains? Does it affect properties nearest to the stormwater inlet? Would it go away if the inlet was bigger? Is there a formal drainage system nearby? And would it go away if the drains were cleared? So all of these types of issues are generally stormwater issues rather than overland flow issues. Okay, so the floodplain risk management process. This is a process under which all councils within New South Wales assess and manage flood risk. It's stipulated by the state government through their flood-prone land policy. The guidance documents that we use, I have a picture here of the floodplain development manual, but it's actually recently, in the last 2 months or so, been updated to the flood risk management manual. The general principles are fairly similar, but obviously it has evolved as you know, new technologies and things are available. So councils are guided through this process through a series of stages. The first stage, as I mentioned before, completed in 2016, is an investigation to define the flood behaviour and provide mapping of those, the catchment, mapping of the flood risk within the catchment. And then we move forward to the studies that we've been doing today. So the floodplain risk management study and the floodplain risk management plan. And these studies are where we look at that flood behaviour and strategies are identified so that council has a long-term strategy for managing flood risk in the catchment or in the study area. By following this process, it allows council to seek funding from the state and federal government to support the development of the plans as well as the implementation. So the overall project goals that have guided the study are that we wanted to assess flood risk. So I keep using this term, but flood risk is really about the interaction of flood waters with human occupation. So, you know, when there's water in a creek, we're not as concerned about it, but it's when it's out on the road or affecting people's properties is when, you know, that's where the flood risk can occur. Once we've identified the flood risk, we look to identify and assess a range of management strategies, and then collaboratively with feedback from the Floodplain Management Committee, council staff and the community, we develop a plan, so a long-term strategy for council to implement. So I talk about these flooding hotspots. So these are locations where we really tried to target mitigation strategies. So there were some preliminary hotspots identified in the flood study, other hotspots identified from council officers. So they came through those complaints database that we were provided, as well as we use our modelling outputs. So we produce a range of mapping coming out of the tools that were developed in the flood study. We have a map here called hydraulic hazard, which is a metric of how fast and deep the water is. So at the locations where it's more hazardous, so obviously where there's more flood risk. The other maps that I've got here, one is sort of demonstrating the areas that are important to the movement of the flood through the catchment, as well as just generally flood depth. So as I mentioned before, overland flow is typically very shallow, but when there is a location where it reaches substantial depths, it's somewhere that we identify as a hotspot to try to target mitigation strategies. The final piece of the puzzle that we use is we have an assessment of the overflow inundation. So we try to understand how many properties within the catchment might be impacted in a particular event. And we use that to help identify, you know, where there's clusters of overflow inundation. So overall, we had 22 locations that were identified. We were able to group these into 11 hotspots. And as I mentioned, these are the locations where we tried to target strategies to help improve the flood risk. Sorry, just lost my train of thought there. So I keep talking about these strategies. They really fall into three categories. Flood modification measures. These are physical structures that we test with the model to implement in the catchment to change the flood behaviour and improve it. Flood response measures. So these are things like they're to alter the community and the stakeholders' response to flooding. So it's things like community education, information for the SES to implement during the operations of a flood, and the final measure are property modifications. And so these generally relate to how council assesses development. So future development, looking at strategies to help reduce the flood risk for those. So as I mentioned, we looked at flood modification measures across the catchment. So the map showing here is we looked at 14 separate locations. Some of them had a sequence of works, but generally 14 different options were looked at. We found that some weren't viable. So these either did not reduce flood risk, had very significant constraints, and constraints may include things like not being able to physically fit the option or the works there. But the ones with the crosses are ones that we found not to be viable, and the ones with the ticks are ones that we found to be viable and to move forward to further investigation. So the recommendations that were identified in the plan, the ones I've listed here are ones that council can move forward themselves. They don't require collaboration with other authorities or for other things to happen. So these ones are, you know, relatively straightforward in the scheme of things. So the local drainage upgrade. So this really tries to address the local drainage complaints that had come from the community. The model at the scale that we have now isn't suitable for looking at very small drainage issues. So the recommendation there is to, you know, do more detailed investigations at those locations to see if something like an additional inlet may reduce the drainage issue there. There's a detention basin proposed at Peakhurst Park. Another basin proposed in Ruby Reserve, a Croydon Road drainage upgrade, and another detention basin in Crook Park. So as I mentioned before, council can access funding from the state to proceed with the feasibility studies of these works, and then again to seek funding for the implementation of those. So then there was another series of recommendations, which these were really reliant on other activities occurring or for collaboration with other authorities. So there was the Beverly Hills drainage channel duplication. So this was to be considered as part of the master planning associated with Beverly Hills. The Morgan Street railway culvert upgrade. So this obviously has to be undertaken in conjunction with Sydney Trains. The Stony Creek Road upgrade. This is culvert upgrade, sorry, is to be undertaken with Transport for New South Wales and Sydney Water, because the channel is owned by Sydney Water. The Lyle Avenue drainage upgrade. So this one is really a sequential drainage upgrade as redevelopment occurs, because a lot of this drainage line exists under existing properties. The Morgan Street drainage upgrade. This is also a localised investigation, and this one falls back into that LDO1, which I showed on the previous slide. And so, as I've said there, council can progress these opportunities as the opportunities arise. So I'll just go through now the response modifications. So the first one is develop local flood plans, including the information that comes out of this study. So this is an SES document that provides information of the flood risks and things that need to occur in the event of a flood. Flood emergency response coordination. So this one is about council, the SES, and other authorities that are responsible for something during a flood event all being on the same page. It talks about having peacetime meetings so that, when we're not in the threat of a flood emergency, that, we make sure everybody understands their responsibilities. A flood warning system. So this one comes up quite a lot in this type of studies. The nature of the inundation in this catchment make it very, very challenging to implement a traditional flood warning system. So the recommendation is to provide advice to the community on what the Bureau of Meteorology's severe weather warnings mean and whether that may translate to flooding within the catchment. So that feeds into the next one as well, which is about community flood education and awareness. So council does a lot of this anyway through some of the systems that are in place. It's currently called a 10.7 certificate. When property exchanges in sale, a 10.7 certificate is attached to the contract of sale, and it provides information on whether the project might be, the property might be subject to flood controls. Councils can also use that report to provide additional information, and so that might include things like a map of the flooding at that property. So it's really just about giving the community more and more information so that they can understand and manage their flood risk. The next one is improvements to driver safety. So there were a few locations across the catchment that we found that high hazard flooding was occurring on the roads. So a good strategy to manage the risk at those locations is to provide indicators, so depth indicators or signage, so that the community is aware that, if there's water on this road, it could be quite hazardous. So the property modifications. So again, these all relate to the planning controls that are imposed on new development. So the biggest one that we talk about is the flood planning level. And so this is a level to which new properties are required to have their floor level, their habitable floor level. And typically it's the 1% plus half a metre. We have a secondary control here where when there is very low hazard flooding, very shallow depths, the freeboard required is only 0.3. And there are some controls around looking at having sensitive or hazardous uses outside the area of flood risk. So that's what we call the probable maximum flood. And also some controls around underground car park entrances to ensure that water can't get into those. So the next piece of that is the flood planning area. So that's the area to which those controls apply. So this is actually one of the elements that has changed. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And the next one is around allowing floodproofing for non-residential properties. So this one relates to allowing the use of flood resilient materials in commercial properties, commercial or industrial properties, so that they can recover more quickly following a flood. Okay, and then finally, we've reviewed council's existing development controls and just had some sort of more general recommendations to help the use of that document, and they included updating of the terminology to make sure it's consistent with current policies. There's a currently control that requires there to be a freeboard on the PMF, so reconsidering whether that's appropriate. There is a new flood planning clause was included in every LEP across the state, so local environment plan, that occurred last July. There's a second clause that is still being drafted, but it allows councils to apply controls to those sensitive and vulnerable uses. So councils need to opt in to have that clause included in their local environment plans. We recommend that that's done. The next one is ensuring that the flood planning area map is available for the community to view, and also considering the available flood mapping in any future redevelopment or rezoning proposals. So again, I mentioned earlier these 10.7 certificates, but ensuring the current flood information is available on those certificates. There's two other property measures which we did look at for this study area. They're called voluntary purchase and voluntary house raising. They relate to existing properties, but they were not recommended for this study area. So the next bit I was going to talk about was the outcomes of the public exhibition. So this study actually went on public exhibition twice because there were some changes made to the report. So the first exhibition was undertaken in June 2022. It was placed on exhibition for 28 days, and the ultimate aim of public exhibition is to gather feedback from the community and other stakeholders. So the exhibition period was advertised in the leader on the 15th of the 6th, 2022. There was also council's webpage and social media platforms were used to provide information on the study and its outcomes. It was mapping and some frequently asked questions and some things like that. Also, property owners that were identified as being within the flood planning area were formally notified in writing. So the outcomes of that were that we received 17 written submissions. There were 2 booking sessions held with the council staff member to ask queries and for the council staff member to provide information. There were also 6 phone calls. The general themes of the submission responses that we received were sort of concern about the difference between observed behaviour in the time that the community has lived here versus the predicted behaviour that's presented in the report. And so we did actually add a section about this to the version of the report that went on the next public exhibition. It's not uncommon for even long-term residents to not have experienced the size of flood that we're talking about with the 1% or the 100 years. So there's some more information added to the final version of the report on that. There were some questions around the tagging of the flood-affected properties. This was something that also changed between the 2 versions. The management of future development, so this related to the controls that council applies. The general process, feedback on the recommended strategies, the implementation and timing of these studies. So we understand that it can be quite frustrating for the community to go through the process, but we, it is a long process to get through. The local drainage issues, and again, that prompted the addition of the additional recommendation, and also the maintenance of council's infrastructure. And like I said, there was some additional assessment undertaken following this exhibition in response to the feedback that we received. So those things that were added were that recommendation related to the local drainage areas, So this will allow council to undertake localised assessment. Additional information on the size and scale of the recent storms that had occurred. This is particularly related to the significant storms we had across the state in 2022. An update to the flood planning area and revised mapping at the northern boundary of the study area. There's a very small area that the mapping was revised. So this is that local drainage upgrade that I keep talking about. So the aim of it is to reduce the severity and frequency of nuisance inundation at a number of locations. So there's a number of specific locations listed here, and they all came from the complaints as well as the public exhibition submissions that we received. This does not preclude council from investigating other locations should their concern be raised. Okay, so the next one I was going to talk about is the flood planning area. So a set of criteria was used to identify properties that are subject to flood risk. So as I mentioned, we're looking at very shallow inundation across this catchment. So it's important that we don't tag properties when they only have a very small impact from the flood behaviour. So the criteria that was used was puddles less than 50 square metres were removed from the mapping extent. Lots needed to be impacted by more than 10% of their area by a depth of greater than 150 millimetres. So the original criteria also included lots greater than 80 metres from an adjacent tagged lot had to have 25% of their lot impacted. So this was to try and capture isolated properties. And that resulted in 2003 lots selected. Now, as we evolved the study, that last criteria that I mentioned was removed, and we added a criteria that considered where the flow paths were, where the areas of most significant conveyance were, which is the floodway, where there was a low spot, and a storage area. And so this actually increased the lots that were tagged by just over 300 there. So this was the final criteria that was used in the final report. And that was really, the change was in response to some of the feedback we received during the exhibition. So then the report needed to go on exhibition again, and that occurred in June 2023. And again, it was placed on exhibition for 28 days, again advertised in the Leader. There was a media release also issued by council in relation to the public exhibition period. There was again the online information on council's website, including mapping and those frequently asked questions. And again, property owners included within the flood planning area were formally written to allow them to provide feedback. So the outcomes of this exhibition were 18 written responses were received, 4 book-in sessions, and 10 phone calls. Very similar themes to the first exhibition, including maintenance of council infrastructure. But this is referring to drainage pipes and pits and so forth. Again, there was still some commentary around the tagged properties, so the flood planning area properties. There was concerns that the public exhibition hadn't been appropriately advertised. The local drainage issues was another issue that came up again, as well as that understanding of the scale of the flood problem that we're looking at compared to the flood behaviour that's been experienced by some of the residents, management of future development, the general process, and flood risk at individual properties. So in this second exhibition, there were some questions where the community was seeking advice on what their specific flood risk was. And so there was some minor updates again coming out of this second exhibition period, some very minor amendments to 2 of the recommendations. That second one is that local drainage recommendation. So it added some locations that were identified through the next exhibition. The model developed in the study included a very small portion of the Kogarah LGA, so it was decided to remove that from this because there will be a separate study at some point in the future of that area, so it wasn't appropriate for those properties to be tagged as part of this process. As well as the final element that was included in the report, all the submissions that were received through the 2 exhibition periods have been summarised and a response provided, and that's included in the final report as Appendix E. So where to from here? So I suppose the next stage would be for the committee to endorse the study for adoption by council. Is there any questions?
Or any discussion from any of our members? No? Just on that note, I'll pass it over to Hayley.
So you've just been advised after the report was published, the first exhibition date is actually from the 25th of May to the 3rd of July. So that will be updated in this report as it goes through the Assets and Infrastructure Committee. So it actually was for that 28-day period.
Thank you, Hayley. Is there any other discussion before we conclude tonight's meeting? Yeah, are you able to use your mic if that's okay? Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to address the residents' comment about the minutes of the previous meeting.
Yes.
I've just gone through them. I don't disagree with them, but I was wondering if there was any opportunity to record the discussion that was held at that meeting. I don't know if that's normal meeting practice here to do that, but I don't know whether that would address the residents' query about that.
Do you want to answer that, Hayley, or do you want me to?
We'll probably have to look at the transcript.
Transcript?
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, the not normal council practice is not to include verbatim discussion in the minutes of the meeting. So this is following along the same lines as we would do in a normal council meeting. However, the verbatim discussion has been recorded and was actually and was broadcast on the night. So yeah, there is a record and a recording of the verbatim discussion, but it's not usual practice for us to actually record all of those. And yeah, so Marissa's just confirmed that it's still available on the council website.
May I give you permission to ask a question, please?
Do you want to? Yeah, sure. Are you able to speak on this thing?
The webcast is inadequate. The webcast is scattered, indifferent, unclear, focused incorrectly. That happened because our visitors were not familiar with our microphones. That was number one. So whatever the webcast may be available, the webcast to me as a ratepayer is inadequate. And to compound that inadequacy, the recorded minutes are not reflective. It is true that there were many questions with notice. Those questions with notice are not verbatim. They are questions with notice, and they can be included in here, because if they were accepted from the person asking, then they are equally acceptable for the rest of the community to know. So I hope we can recognise it. You want to answer first?
Mr. Chair, I was just going to mention that those questions that were actually raised at that meeting, it's not usual practice for us to then include those in the minutes either. Usually with questions of a closed committee like this, they'd be communicated back to the committee members or to the individual that asked the question.
So you're saying that the ratepayers don't have an interest in what was raised by somebody who is a community representative, other councils that have a representative here to learn. My concern is, as a ratepayer, I am...
No, well, I appreciate your concern on what you're asking, but are we able to discuss this afterwards, only because it's not part of the agenda?
The minutes are the agenda.
Well, thank you. I'll take that on notice. Is there any other discussion on today's items? No, well, I conclude this meeting at 7:10 p.m. Thank you. I need to take a motion to adopt. I need a mover and seconder to adopt the motion. Sorry.
So I'll move that, Mr. Chair.
Do I have a seconder? All right, I acknowledge that it's now passed because we're not voting on it.
Not
No. So thank you. Now I conclude the meeting at 7:10 p.m. Thank you.